The first step in disarming a narcissistic personality is far more subtle than most people imagine. It does not begin with confrontation, arguments, or attempts to prove your point. In fact, the more you try to reason with a narcissistic mind, the more energy you unknowingly give to the very system that feeds on it. What truly disrupts this dynamic is something much quieter, yet psychologically far more powerful: silence. A narcissistic individual depends on emotional reactions. Anger, frustration, defense, explanations. These are all forms of attention. And attention is the currency through which they maintain influence. Every reaction confirms that they still occupy space inside your mind. Carl Jung often suggested that what we react to unconsciously begins to control us. When you become predictable in your reactions, you become easy to manipulate. Silence interrupts that pattern. When you refuse to engage in the emotional theater, the narcissistic strategy begins to collapse. The criticism no longer provokes a defense. The provocation no longer creates drama. The accusations no longer pull you into long explanations. Instead, there is calmness, composure, and distance. To the narcissistic psyche, this is deeply unsettling, because it removes the mirror they rely on to feel powerful. But silence here does not mean weakness or suppression. It is not passive avoidance. It is controlled restraint. It is the deliberate decision to step outside the psychological game entirely. When you remain calm, observant, and emotionally steady, you reclaim authority over your inner world. And once that happens, their ability to provoke you begins to disappear. Over time, something interesting occurs. Without the reactions they expect, the narcissistic individual often escalates their behavior in an attempt to recover control. Yet this escalation exposes their patterns more clearly, not only to you, but often to others around them. In trying to regain power, they begin to undermine themselves. And that is the quiet paradox. The less you fight the narcissistic game, the faster it collapses. Because the greatest power you possess is not the ability to defeat someone in conflict, but the discipline to deny the conflict the energy it needs to survive. Once silence has disrupted the emotional theater, the next shift becomes equally important: removing the attention that fuels the narcissistic dynamic. Attention, in many ways, is psychological oxygen. And for the narcissistic personality, it is not merely pleasant, it is necessary. Without it, their carefully constructed sense of importance begins to feel unstable. A narcissistic individual often organizes their behavior around one central objective, remaining the center of emotional gravity. This can appear in many forms: seeking admiration, provoking conflict, creating drama, or even positioning themselves as the victim. But beneath all these strategies lies the same mechanism. They must keep your focus fixed on them. When you begin to withdraw that focus, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop rewarding the behaviors that were designed to control you. Complaints no longer receive long explanations. Provocations no longer produce emotional debates. Attempts to create jealousy, guilt, or confusion meet a calm neutrality. In essence, you are quietly stepping out of the psychological stage where the performance was meant to take place. This is not about hostility or coldness. It is about discipline. Your energy becomes selective. Your attention moves toward your work, your growth, your peace of mind, and the people who genuinely contribute to your well-being. And as this shift occurs, the narcissistic individual begins to experience something unfamiliar, a loss of influence. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of reclaiming one's psychic energy. When too much of our attention is absorbed by another person's manipulations, we gradually lose connection with our own inner center. But when that attention is reclaimed, the balance of power changes immediately. What once seemed overwhelming becomes strangely small. The narcissistic personality may attempt to intensify their behavior to draw you back into the cycle. Yet, without the reward of attention, those efforts gradually weaken. The drama no longer produces results, and the structure that depended on your engagement begins to collapse under its own weight. And this leads to a quiet realization that many people overlook control does not survive where attention is no longer given. Because the moment you stop feeding the need for attention, you begin reclaiming the authority over where your life's energy truly belongs. As your silence removes emotional fuel and your attention is no longer easily captured, another transformation begins to take shape, one that is less visible, but deeply influential. This is the quiet practice of establishing boundaries. Not the kind that are loudly announced or repeatedly defended, but the kind that are demonstrated through calm, consistent behavior. Many people believe boundaries must always be explained. They feel the need to justify their decisions, to convince the other person that their limits are reasonable. But with a narcissistic personality, this often becomes another opportunity for debate, manipulation, or emotional pressure. The more you explain, the more material you provide for them to challenge. Instead, the most effective boundaries are often the ones that require very few words. You begin by quietly changing your level of access. Your time becomes more protected. Your personal information becomes more selective. Your emotional availability becomes more measured. You no longer feel obligated to respond immediately, to defend every decision, or to participate in every conversation that is designed to pull you back into conflict. What you are doing here is subtle but powerful. You are redefining the structure of the relationship without asking for permission to do so. Carl Jung spoke about the importance of psychological individuation, the process of becoming fully aligned with one's own inner authority. Boundaries are an expression of that authority. They signal that your sense of self is no longer dependent on another person's approval or reaction. For the narcissistic individual, this shift is deeply unsettling. Their influence depended on unrestricted access to your emotions, your time, and your responses. When that access quietly narrows, their ability to shape your experience begins to fade. Interestingly, the more calm and consistent these boundaries remain, the less room there is for manipulation. There is no dramatic argument to win, no emotional reaction to exploit. Only a steady pattern of behavior that makes your limits unmistakably clear. And over time, something becomes evident. People can only control the parts of your life you allow them to enter. The moment you begin choosing that access deliberately, you stop living inside their psychological territory and start standing firmly within your own. As these quiet boundaries begin to reshape the dynamic, another shift becomes essential, one that takes place not in your actions, But in your inner state, it is the discipline of becoming emotionally unreachable to manipulation. Now, this does not mean becoming cold, indifferent, or disconnected from life. Quite the opposite. It means that your emotional center is no longer easily accessed by someone whose primary strategy is to provoke reactions. A narcissistic personality is highly skilled at identifying emotional triggers. They study what makes you defensive, what makes you feel guilty, what creates anger or insecurity. And once those triggers are known, they are often used repeatedly. The reason this works is simple. When your emotions are pulled into the conflict, your clarity begins to disappear. Instead of observing the behavior, you become absorbed in reacting to it. And the moment that happens, the narcissistic individual has successfully shifted the focus away from their actions and onto your emotional response. To step out of this cycle requires a different posture of mind, one rooted in awareness rather than reaction. Carl Jung often emphasized the importance of confronting the unconscious patterns within ourselves. Many of our reactions are automatic, shaped by past experiences, fears, or the desire to be understood. When someone provokes those reactions, they are essentially pressing psychological buttons that were installed long before the current conflict began. But awareness changes this dynamic. When you begin observing your own emotional responses, instead of immediately acting on them, a space appears between stimulus and reaction. In that space lies freedom. You start to recognize the patterns for what they are: attempts to provoke, distract, or control the narrative. And when those attempts no longer produce the emotional effect they were designed to create, their influence weakens. Your calmness becomes a form of psychological armor. Your composure becomes a signal that the usual strategies no longer apply. What once triggered intense reactions now meets steady observation. Over time, the manipulative game loses its power because it depends entirely on emotional access. And the deeper truth is this: the moment you learn to guard your emotional center, you stop being a participant in their drama and become the quiet observer of it.
Once you begin protecting your emotional center, another profound shift becomes possible, perhaps the most transformative one of all. Instead of directing your energy toward resisting the narcissistic dynamic, you begin directing it toward your own growth. This may sound simple, but psychologically it changes everything. When someone is entangled in a manipulative relationship, an enormous amount of mental energy is consumed by defense. You think about what was said, what it meant, how you should respond, how to prove your point, how to prevent the next conflict. Gradually, your attention becomes organized around the other person's behavior. Your inner life begins orbiting around their reactions. Carl Jung warned about this very phenomenon. He believed that the greatest danger to the human psyche is losing connection with one's own path of development. When your awareness becomes fixated on another person's shadow, their manipulation, their control, their emotional games, you slowly neglect your own process of growth. But the moment your focus returns to yourself, something powerful begins to unfold. You invest your energy in learning, building, improving your skills, strengthening your character, expanding your perspective. Your time becomes less about defending your worth and more about developing it. And as this happens, a quiet confidence starts to emerge. This confidence is different from pride or ego. It is grounded in self-respect. It grows from the recognition that your life has direction beyond the conflict. For a narcissistic individual, this shift is deeply destabilizing. Their influence relied on keeping you psychologically entangled, reacting, explaining, defending. But when your attention moves toward your own evolution, their ability to occupy your mental space begins to shrink. You are no longer fighting them. You are outgrowing the dynamic entirely. And perhaps the most surprising outcome is that the more you grow, the less relevant their manipulation becomes. What once felt overwhelming now appears small, almost predictable, because the truth is simple but often forgotten. The strongest response to manipulation is not endless resistance. It is personal expansion. When your life becomes larger than the conflict quietly loses its place in your life. And when all of these shifts begin to work together, your silence, your control over attention, your quiet boundaries, your emotional discipline, and your focus on personal growth, something inevitable begins to happen. The narcissistic dynamic starts to reveal itself without your intervention. In a sense, the individual begins to neutralize themselves. One of the defining traits of a narcissistic personality is the constant need to maintain a carefully crafted image. They rely heavily on perception. To the outside world, they may present confidence, charm, or even moral superiority. But maintaining that image requires a certain level of cooperation from the people around them. It depends on others reacting, defending, explaining, or participating in the emotional drama that keeps the illusion alive. When you quietly withdraw from that role, the structure becomes unstable. Carl Jung often spoke about the concept of the shadow, the hidden aspects of personality that individuals refuse to acknowledge within themselves. For a narcissistic individual, much of their behavior is an attempt to keep that shadow concealed. But when there is no longer a reaction to control, no argument to win, and no emotional chaos to hide behind, their own patterns begin to surface more clearly. Often this leads to escalation. They may attempt stronger provocations, louder accusations, or more dramatic attempts to regain attention and authority. But here is the paradox. The more extreme these efforts become, the more visible the pattern appears to others. What was once subtle manipulation can begin to look like instability or hostility. And importantly, this exposure happens without you needing to accuse, explain, or fight. Your role becomes simply that of calm observation. You remain steady while the behavior reveals itself. Over time, people tend to recognize patterns on their own. When they see consistency in your composure and inconsistency in the other person's reactions, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore. In this way, truth begins to emerge naturally, and perhaps the most important realization is this: you do not have to destroy a manipulative dynamic for it to end. Sometimes all you have to do is step out of it and allow it to collapse under the weight of its own nature